All right. So far, we have done natural selection in its entirety. So the point of this video is the other four fingers of evolution, or forces of evolution. Okay, so we're actually going to start with the pinky, starting strong, pinky strong. This is genetic drift. Now, that's the fancy word for a small population. Okay, so genetic drift is just non-selective. It's totally random as to creating a large population and turning it into a small population. And this is going to create very large changes in allele frequencies very quickly because you're going to see an overrepresentation of an allele just because the overall population shrinks so much. So genetic drift is usually when we are reducing genetic variation or we're losing alleles completely, which is going to make some alleles be overrepresented in the next generation. So if we look at this example, all of the white boxes become like selected. So we went from having like a larger majority of like red to there's only one actual red flower, and then we've got this incomplete dominance pink, and then we've got this white. And so you can see that when these get selected in the next generation, our percentage of the allele changes. So it went from 0.7% of the dominant allele, which is red, to only 0.5. But then in the next generation, all of these guys are gone, they die off, and so this is the small population. So then we're all red all the time. And so it's really looking at how like the selection of just a small group of individuals drastically changes the population of the next generation. So genetic drift basically is we take a very small sample size and that creates a larger chance of deviation just statistically. It's describing allele frequencies and how they fluctuate. And there are two big examples of genetic drift within the world. The first one is the bottleneck effect, and the second is the founder's effect. So we're going to talk about those two. All right, so the founder's effect is similar to gene flow, but it's like looking at the population that left. And so we can say there is a founding population. These four people leave their big population and they move over here. And so the descendants look very, very different than the original population. And then same thing here, a small group of individuals leaves and goes in a different direction. And now the resulting population is going to be very different and adapted in a different way because we've lost alleles. So like here, we didn't get any gray ones, so you're not going to see any gray beetles in the next generation because we completely lost that allele. Same thing here, we don't have any black beetles. So in this one, we don't have any black beetles in the descendant generation. And that's the founder's effect. They leave, they go start their own little colony. Okay. Remember, we're talking about the founder effect is just those individuals are isolated from the larger group. They're leaving the larger group. And so the allele frequencies of the smaller population are drastically different than the allele frequencies of the large population. You'll see overrepresentation or underrepresentation from the initial population. Next one is the bottleneck effect. Bottleneck effect is a fancy way to say like there's some natural disaster that kills off a lot of the population. So it's a sudden reduction in the population size, and this is something completely due to the environment. So it can be like a hurricane comes and takes out some population of starfish or something like that. So it's any natural disaster or human impact that causes the reduction in the population size. Again, the resulting gene pool is going to look very different than the original because it was completely random what died off. And so because the population is small, it's going to continue to be affected by genetic drift. Now, one of the things that they like to talk about when we talk about genetic drift is because the population shrinks so much, as we evolve, so the new population that is forming, it's going to be a lot of inbreeding. So it's going to facilitate this bad process of inbreeding. And so one of the things they like to talk about is this prairie chicken experiment. Basically, there was a disease that wiped out a ton of these prairie chickens. Like the population shrank drastically. And so when the population shrank, what they noticed was that because of the shrinking of the population, there was a lot of inbreeding and it facilitated a harmful allele building up in that population. That harmful allele caused the eggs of the prairie chicken to not hatch. They ended up not being able to like break through their little shells. Um, and it was just one of the alleles that kind of became present, and it facilitated, because it was the same individuals constantly reproducing, it facilitated that inbreeding and it built up that harmful allele. So inbreeding, bad. It causes, harmful alleles to be overrepresented in a population. So here's the prairie chicken experiment. You can pause and you can like read all of the data points and stuff. But basically, chickens were not able to hatch their eggs because of the harmful allele that built up due to the drastic decrease. So the individuals that ended up living were the ones that had that harmful allele, and then they continued to pass it on to the next generation. Oh, that's the story of the prairie chickens. And remember, the surviving birds had really low levels of genetic variation. Only 50% of their, eggs were hatching, and so their population struggled to regrow. What they did to fix this, kind of as they moved forward, is they actually introduced more prairie chickens to that population in Indiana to help with the success of the prairie chickens. And then they got the hatch rate to increase to 90% just because of introducing variability. All right, so 1, genetic drift, small population, same thing. 2, genetic drift causes the allele frequencies to change at random. Remember, this is a random selection. It has nothing to do with environmental pressures as far as like natural selection is concerned. So it's completely random in that sense. Genetic drift is causing a loss of genetic variation, and sometimes we'll even lose alleles completely. And then genetic drift also can cause harmful alleles to become fixed in a population, meaning that they'll continue to be passed down from generation to generation, even though it's not adapted or it's not a good allele to have represented. And then last but not least, it does facilitate inbreeding, and that's like what we talked about, that drastic reduction in variation is not necessarily good. As a population, you're more adapted if you can be more heterozygous. All right. So the next finger is the non-random or selective mating. For your purposes, this is another type of natural selection. The environmental pressure is finding a mate. And so College Board likes to count this as a type of natural selection. So do me a favor, don't use this one as an example of anything other than natural selection, but it is its own little force in a way. And so I just screenshotted a bunch of really pretty birds because they're good examples of selective mating. Only the prettier male birds are the ones that actually get selected. And so those are the alleles that are going to be represented in the next generation. One thing I want to point out is that it truly shows that fitness is your reproductive success. So like these birds are the ones that get to, pass their genes on to the next generation because those are the ones that the mates are looking for. However, it's probably not beneficial to be a really, really bright standout bird, especially if you're hunted by larger birds or animals, because you're going to stand out. And so you'll see in populations that there will be like a very drab or like plain colored female, and then the males end up being these really, really bright birds. And it's just interesting that those are the alleles that get picked, even though that's not what helps them blend in, it's what helps them find a mate. All right, I reserve the right to not teach this and click through this really fast because these are mutations and we've already done this. If you need to, you can go back to the video and genetics at some point that goes through this, but mutations do cause new alleles to be introduced. And so with mutations and then sexual reproduction as well, it's what we increase genetic variation. So ways to increase genetic variation is good. We love that. And so when you're thinking of these, always be thinking of, does this increase my genetic variation or decrease my genetic variation? And so like when we talked about genetic drift, that decreases genetic variation. That's not good. When we talked about non-random mating, that's like very selective. So it's actually decreasing our genetic variation. But introducing new alleles through mutation, sexual reproduction, creating more of a heterozygous environment or population, that's all increasing your genetic variation. And that makes you very adapted, not necessarily as an individual, but as a population. To be more heterozygous is better for a population. And so this is not all the phenotypes. Phenotypic variation is going to be heritable just because some of it is like happening within like a lifetime. But the variation that is heritable is really, really good, and natural selection can only act on the genetic component. So if there's a phenotype that is determined by a mutation, or a phenotype that's determined by a genetic code, if it's good and it helps benefit the organism, that's the one that's going to pass on to the next generation. So again, once all of a sudden we get a mutation in this generation, now we've got a brand new allele and we are more varied as a population. And so that changes nucleotide sequences. It's mutations that can cause new genes and new alleles to arise, and it's how we become more and more complex. This is going to be really important when we get to like macro evolution, but right now we're just in micro, so we're just talking about how it introduces new variation into a population. All right, so these are just types of mutations, and I'm just going to click through these really fast. Okay, we need to make sure we review this one though. And sexual reproduction, I'm going to lump in with this. It's increasing your genetic variation, and so it's giving us the ability to be more, heterozygous as a population. And so some things that through sexual reproduction are helping us become more varied is that crossing over process in prophase 1, the independent assortment of alleles. It's like you might get your mom's or your dad's and your gamete to pass down onto the next generation. And then last but not least, like fertilization, like the ability of two people to come together and mix their alleles is another one that increases that. So those are the three things that have to do with sexual reproduction that increase our genetic variation. All right, gene flow, very simple with this one. Gene flow is either you're imigrating, I just said it weird so that you would get it. It's going into a new gene pool. So all of those alleles that previously were not there are now being introduced, and that's increasing our genetic variation, and we like that. There's also immigration, which is individuals are exiting. We're looking at that original population though, because we're not following the old one. So we're still a pretty large population, but we did decrease our genetic variation by losing people. And so when we talk about gene flow, we have to look very specifically, are we talking about them coming into a population or out of a population? And these are can be examples of genetic drift in a way, but we're going to make sure that we talk about them being movement. So we're not going to get hung up on that these kind of bleed into each other. So one of the things that we like to talk about is plants. Plants have really, really good gene flow because there's no way to control like pollen and seed dispersal. And so they're all over the place. So you'll see a lot of heterozygosity in plants because they're constantly cross-pollinating with each other. And they're able to do that really, really well because they can then self-fertilize. And so that was a bunch of bent grass, and they showed like how far away from a mine they were able to get. All right, so that's gene flow. It can increase your fitness just because it's lots of movement in between areas. So that's like it for the most part. I have this article you can read. It's the Future American. It talks about how people don't stay put. And so we're actually becoming a really good heterozygous population. My time's about to run out. You guys are awesome. Have a great day.